Welcome to The Right Angle, the podcast that's all things English and fantasy. Hi, I'm Autumn.
And I'm Abby, and today we're borrowing from our season 1 theme to dip our toes into another form of storytelling, the visual arts.
And who better to join us to speak on this than our friend Lydia? She's a graphic design major who loves digital art, reading, and of course, fantasy.
Lydia, we're so excited to have you.
Yeah, thanks for letting me on. I'm excited to talk with you guys.
So, Lydia, you're a big fan of fantasy. What books, movies, or series pulled you in first?
I think what really drove me into fantasy for the first time would be, and this is kind of an embarrassing thing to say, but whenever I was in the earlier parts of my middle school years, I really got into, and I'm probably sure a lot of people have probably heard of this before, but I really as a kid got into the Warrior Cat series. It was embarrassingly one of the few things I would read obsessively, and I just remember it wasn't necessarily about the story around it, but I loved that it was like a world I got to just go in. If I just wanted to like go somewhere else for a little bit, I just remember as a kid being able to do that. And I think that was one of, if not the biggest influences that kind of drove me into fantasy as a whole. So I definitely would say, though it is maybe a little bit embarrassing now, definitely one of my biggest draws into like a fantasy kind of world.
Funnily enough, that was also my first fantasy series that I really got into in elementary school, right before I got into like Harry Potter. So I think, strangely enough, both you and me share this common fact that the thing that got us into fantasy was the Warrior Cat series, which I think is kind of awesome.
I mean, I wasn't a huge fan of the Warrior Cat series as a kid, but I definitely think that there is something to be said about how addictive those books were to kids our age in the era that we grew up in. And I think it's cool that it's brought a lot of people to fantasy, whether they're big fantasy fans or just casually like it. So I don't think it's anything you need to be embarrassed about because honestly, we all read strange little books when we were kids.
Lydia, in discussions we've had in the past, I know you read a lot of fantasy nowadays. So, do you have a favorite world or a favorite character?
I think for me, and I think this is very much a personal thing, I really do love seeing really cool like characters and complexity and all of that, but I think and this I'm guessing this is probably just a me thing, but I think what one of the biggest thing whenever I do read a book is just figuring out the world that they put together and just being able to discover that. I think that is one of my biggest draws for a fantasy book and something that I really try to look for and try to like cultivate based off of what I read. So I unfortunately don't really have a favorite character. And that's not to say I don't appreciate like really cool character things. I just more focus on like a lot of the worlds kind of around the story, which might sound a bit pretentious, but it is kind of just what I notice more with the book. And I think my favorite world that has ever been built, and this is again not too embarrassing, but just something a little bit nerdy of me. I really, really, really love the world that the games The Legend of Zelda have built up around themselves, and I hate to say it, but I think it is one of the most detailed and complex worlds written, which is insane because it's a video game, not even like, a book-based world, but it is just so amazing to see like the amount of work they put into that and how much care they put into that world, and I think that is probably one of my favorite worlds to ever be like constructed. Just one of my favorites overall. Not to say that there are a lot of good ones or that aren't a lot of good ones, but I think that is by far my favorite world.
I absolutely agree. All of the Zelda world building is very in depth and thorough, and it being a video game, it really feels like you're there. And I think it's especially cool that you, as an artist and just a fantasy lover in general, that you're more drawn to world building and, perhaps the plot and the things that are happening around the characters more than the characters themselves. I think that's super awesome. Speaking of worlds and how characters interact, You are a part of our D&D campaign that we've spoken about a couple times on this podcast already and will continue to speak on. Does that interactive aspect influence your creativity as an artist at all?
Yes, for sure, definitely. You really have to think creatively about a lot of those kind of like, situations and everything, but I didn't realize until I really got into it how much creativity you can get from like just doing something like small and silly with your friends, like how many ideas and thoughts you can get from that. It is something I did not expect to see, but there are just like so much creativity in just like one small little group or for only like a couple of hours, but it's almost kind of its own kind of brainstorming session in its own thing, though it's probably not, the main point of it. Like it just like really makes you think from a different point of view almost a little bit. That's one thing I've noticed, definitely, especially from the different point of view. That's I think one of the biggest influences that I think creatively it's kind of had on me.
So we've been talking about fantasy and how much you enjoy it, not just in like the traditional book aspect, but also in the D&D aspect. Do you find that your love for fantasy sneaks into your artwork at all?
I think I really do. I think I've always kind of been that way. Not even just with fantasy, but kind of just let a lot of my like imagination kind of go with what I'm creating and I try to just in more subtle ways, I guess fantasy kind of shows through, but I think that more just like thinking creatively and like fantasy related things are just really similar. And so I do always think, kind of without realizing it subconsciously, I think I always involve fantasy related things with what I'm creating and not even just like fantasy specific things. I do think that creativity and thinking in a more fantastical kind of mindset, that they're both just very closely tied together and related, that it's almost hard not to involve a lot of that whenever you're just creating something. So I think it's more of like a subconscious thing that I'm always doing is just like thinking in like a different mindset, but just kind of getting into that creative mindset.
That's really cool. One thing that I thought about during this is, do you ever sketch some of the characters you read about or that come about in D&D when we're playing?
Yeah, I definitely think I have a little bit of a tendency to do that. It's definitely not as much as you probably would see other artists doing. It's just I think one of the reasons is I'm just not necessarily as good as at drawing characters, I guess. I just don't think it's something I'm like super drawn to. It's something I really have wanted to improve on this year. Whenever I do draw, it's kind of more I like to focus on like a scene or things around it, like I really enjoy like painting like a scene and stuff like that. And so I think I have a couple of times for sure. I definitely think it's a very fun thing to do. I think one thing that's especially fun is imagining things like in a different context. I think that's something that can be really fun to draw to kind of just push things a bit creatively. I know that can be kind of fun, but I do a little bit, yeah, but I like to really draw out kind of more like the scene around what's happening, if that makes any sense.
I mean, I know you say that you're not the best at character sketches, but I think you're quite good. I mean, you've sketched a lot of our D&D characters, usually in silly situations, and I think that's really fun. You also were the one who made our little avatars for this podcast that people can see are talking, and I think that they're the cutest little things ever, and I'm kind of obsessed with how I look at it. Does that make me a narcissist? So let's switch gears and have you tell us about your art journey. What mediums have you explored?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. I think definitely with college, I've definitely been able to explore a lot more art mediums. I know before college, I remember during my high school years, I was more into just a lot of painting. I know, as a lot of high schoolers do, just a lot of pencil sketches, very, normal basic things. But I know that with college, I've gotten a lot more into things like online art and a lot more just three-dimensional works of art that I didn't really have access to in high school. And so I've definitely been able to explore a lot more with that rather than just, the basic things that high school will give you. And I think that's really given me a lot more to work with recently. I know I've really gotten into oil paints quite a bit, which I'd never tried before college, and I didn't expect how much I'd enjoy them. They are a lot of fun, and I know online art. I'm still kind of getting into that, but I didn't realize how similar it can be to traditional art. I've actually had a lot of fun with that as well, but yeah, just still trying to work on getting a lot of things. I've also had the chance to do some glass blowing as well recently. Not probably something I'd ever want to pursue, but it's definitely something that's a bunch of fun to try out.
You've had a lot of different mediums under your belt at this point, and it's really impressive to see how much you've done. And it's also really cool to hear that being in college has let you explore things you probably never would have been able to try without having a college that has those classes and those resources. So, one thing that has always been kind of a question in my mind is when you're working with these different mediums, do you find that you tend to gravitate towards storytelling differently? So, like, if you're drawing, do you tend to draw scenes of whatever nature more than if you were painting with oils?
Oh my gosh, yes, I definitely do. I tend to gravitate towards like very, very different things whenever I'm doing different mediums. And I think that just comes just because you're using a different technique, you're kind of using a different part of your brain a little bit. And I think that just really comes across in what I want to create. I know especially for painting, I tend to do a lot more idealized scenes where I really like push the colors and I try to push the saturation on them a lot versus whenever I do something more related to online art, I'll still try to push the colors, but I have been finding that with online art, my scenes aren't necessarily as idealized, they're more stylized, if that makes any sense. I tend to push more the actual shapes that I'm using rather than trying to stick to a more idealized version. I have noticed that I really push the actual, this is going to sound very pretentious, but I try to push more the actual concept of what I'm creating and I try to stretch that a bit more than I would stylizing it based off of reality. And that's something that I've noticed I do a lot more with online art than I've ever done with painting before. And I know for drawing, I think that's the one, if I'm ever going to draw something, I think that is one that I will draw the most detailed and realistic that I can. And I think that's just because I have to focus a lot more whenever I'm drawing. Because, and this is a little bit of part of it, I know whenever I draw, I bet it has a name, but I can't really remember. Like if I try to recall a certain image, I can't really bring it and I can't really see it that well. I can definitely see things in my head. I just, whenever I try to like recall what I'm seeing, I can't really see it all too well. And so I have to have an actual image in front of me. And I know whenever I draw, I really try to make things as close as possible because I'll usually use a drawing as my base for anything that I do. So I think drawing is definitely what I apply the most realism to.
For our listeners who may know little to nothing about art, could you let our listeners in on what you mean by idealized versus stylized?
Oh, yeah, definitely. That would definitely be a very good thing to explain to our audience. Whenever I think, at least by my definition, I know it might be different based off person to person, but whenever I think of idealization, I kind of think more you're still trying to stick with the grounds of what it is, still trying to stick with that realism. You're just kind of pushing more, like maybe the colors that you use, how you're gonna soften up some of those lines that you're going to use as well. And so that's kind of what I think of whenever I think of idealization versus the other concept where that would be more taking what's based more on reality and kind of twisting that a bit more. So I know one thing I really think of, like if, you've got like a square building or something like that, in reality, it would be very square, very geometrical. If I were to try to do that online, I might make it so it still looks like a building. I just might pushing it so that it's maybe a more bit spherical, a bit more round, but still retaining the basic idea of a building, but giving it something a bit different to look at, if that makes any sense.
I think that makes sense.
So, you're studying graphic design. What has been the most exciting or surprising part of your program so far?
I guess I'll start with one of the most surprising things I've had is I've actually found that I enjoy it a lot more than I thought I would. I know out of high school I didn't really have a good idea of what it was. I thought it was more of just some marketing thing, but after getting to realize how much art and creativity you have to use with it, I have found that I really, really enjoy it because it's more of bringing somebody's like personal idea to life more than just creating something for a business, which is a part of graphic design. But I think it's a lot more about just translating what somebody wants into something physical, which I really enjoy doing. I like bringing things to life for people. That's one of my favorite things about graphic design. And I think one of the most exciting things is just kind of getting to see what other people can do because there are just some really, really amazingly skilled people that I work with. And it is just so cool just to see like the ideas they can come up with. And it's a lot of fun too, just to work with them and just to see how many ideas we can come up with together. Like recently, me and a group for a project, we designed promotional material for the 50th anniversary of Jaws, and our group, even though one person took up a majority of the illustration for that, our group was able to get an advertisement from the World Theater for that. And I just thought that was really cool because it was kind of like our ideas just thrown together to make into something tangible. And I think that's one of the most exciting things about it.
That's really cool. I didn't know you got to do that. That's awesome. Okay, now that we've talked both sides of you, the fantasy side and the artist side, I want to dig a little bit deeper into how those two connect.
So, what Autumn and I do with writing is we, metaphorically speaking, paint a picture with words. Now, art is that picture literally, but it doesn't lack in the storytelling department at all. Lydia, as an artist and a graphic design student, how do you see storytelling happening in visual art?
Well, there are definitely a lot of things that go into communicating a well thought out and well put together story. I think, and again, there are just a lot of things that go into it, but I think for me personally, one of the biggest things that can go into creating a story with art would be, and again, I think this is just a personal thing, but I like to use a lot of colors to kind of communicate a story with what I'm creating. I think a lot more goes into how we perceive color than we kind of realize at first. Like, the obvious, like, if you see yellow, it makes you feel happy and all of that, but I think with like the colors that you use can completely change a scene. I know I was doing an art study a couple years ago, I believe, where I was kind of testing out different colors just to see how it would change the entire mood of an entire composition, and it drastically impacted it. I know it can just really, really make or break a scene to make it exactly what you want, how you want to have it. And I think just understanding how color can do that is one of the biggest things in communicating whatever story you want to get across. I think another thing that can really contribute to making a really visually impactful story is using a lot of symbolism with what you're creating. I think that by using things that are already very recognizable within your artwork can really help to push a story quite a bit. And what I mean by that is obviously, no, not like just taking somebody's work and making it your own, but just kind of using things that would represent rather than showing directly can really add a layer of complexity to your work that you wouldn't really get otherwise. And I know that's a big thing with writing too, showing and not telling, but that can also be achieved through art by using a lot of symbolism. Trying to think of universal symbols, I know a lot of people will use a lot of cage imagery whenever they're trying to display a feeling of not being able to express themselves or feeling trapped in a certain situation. And by just showing that cage, it can help to communicate that idea without necessarily making it obvious within your artwork, which is just one thing that you can do to really transform it beyond just a picture that you've drawn. And it can just be a picture that you just wanted to create, but if you want to add a story into that, it helps to give some of those symbolic things just to help emphasize your message because you don't necessarily, unless you want to add it in there with graphic novels and things like that, you don't have the ability to just say what you're thinking. And I think just by using a lot of that symbolism, it can really help to transform your artwork into something more than just something you wanted to create. Whereas it can just be something like that, but if you're really wanting to add in some more complex ideas into the artwork you've created, it can be really nice to add in some symbolism.
So, what you're saying is by adding these elements, you're not just painting a picture, you're adding meaning to it. and you're thinking about every element in terms of how it adds meaning to the painting itself. And I know this is not true in like every single situation because sometimes you pick blue because you like blue, but I think that's true for a lot of situations, especially for like professional artists. I think of Banksy as a big one, the famous street graffiti artist who often uses a lot of symbolism in his own art. His works, from what I've seen, aren't the most complex works out there. They're usually made out of black spray paint, and sometimes there's another color, but when he does add that color, there's significance to it. I'm always really impressed with art and its ability to tell a story without words, because art can do a fantastic job of conveying emotion and connecting human ideas and making the viewer feel something. And that's not easy to do. And so I commend you and all other artists who are capable of doing this because I think it's just so incredibly impressive. I know I talked about an artist, but being an artist, Lydia, who is someone you admire? Or what's one of your favorite pieces?
Yeah, of course. I think one person I really admire a lot is one of our professors at our university. He's kind of the head of our art department here, but I think that he puts a lot of time and effort into making things that are able to be easily understood and communicated while still making something that feels very originally him. And that's just something I've always really admired from this professor. And I've just really always respected his input and the amount of effort he puts into things and just how much he cares about what he does overall. I think that's just one of the most admirable things about an artist, that they can just be as committed as they can to what they are doing. And I think I have a lot of personal favorites, but currently one of my favorites would be a bar painting by Edward Monet, and I think it really has stuck out to me because of how the artist was able to tell a story without knowing the context behind it. And even with the context, it's a very complex type of painting, but it's able to communicate a sense of almost dreariness and kind of that idea of maybe not even being unsatisfied with, I guess, your life as a whole, but it really communicates a sense of just almost loneliness to me that I didn't know would really stand out to me within this painting, but it's one of the most captivating parts of this to me. A couple of things I remember about this painting. I know the artist himself was kind of a bit of a social outcast from a lot of other people, and he kind of spent a lot of time at this bar because it was one of the very few places he felt that he belonged, in a sense. And he would do these series of paintings based off of scenes that he would see in these bars. And he tried to stick to more the people who were working at them rather than the customers. He would sometimes do regulars, but people who were more almost stuck to the place like he felt he was. And knowing that context was really interesting, but just by seeing the painting, I just really felt like his use of colors and everything within it communicated an idea that I didn't know I'd resonate with so much until I kind of took a minute just to look at it. And it kind of just became one of my favorites because of the story he was able to make with this. And I just have always, it's just always been one of my favorite paintings. And then as for any personal favorites that I've done, I know right now I'm working on a scene for a class where it was more just to create an isometric city, which is essentially just a top view of a city in a more graphic design style. But I've recently made this kind of cyberpunky city, but I decided to focus more on the darker parts of that. And I know a lot of stories have already gone into that, but kind of focusing on more, not necessarily poverty, but just like a lower side of that. I know a lot of art and media with it tends to focus on, the coolness that it can have. But with this one, I didn't realize what kind of story I wanted to make until I found that it was really cool to draw out the more small parts of the city in places that could almost get really easily forgotten. Kind of like how, in small towns that we live in now, I know you just drive by them and you won't remember them. And I thought that'd be interesting to translate in more of a futuristic world where I feel like you'd still have towns like that, places that you just drive by and forget. And so I also wanted to translate that idea of you don't want your town to be forgotten by adding a lot of ads within this so that it would hopefully drive people in, which kind of, again, kind of goes back into I know a lot of small towns have to really push for advertising, and I didn't realize how much of a story I wanted to create until I just started doing it and how much fun I was having with it. And I kind of just created a story to go along with what I was making. And I think I've had a lot of fun doing that. And I think that's kind of been one of my favorite things to do so far.
That's a really, really cool and interesting idea and concept. It just makes me so grateful that we have you on today.
I couldn't agree more. Not only is your wealth of knowledge when it comes to art and fantasy valuable for us here, we also want to pick your brain a little bit more about graphic design. A lot of people think that graphic design is just logos, or like you mentioned earlier, just some marketing thing. But oddly enough, it is really about storytelling too. So, how do you approach creating a design that tells a story or sends a message?
Yeah, I definitely think a lot of storytelling can go into graphic design. I think one thing I've kind of realized a lot more recently is kind of how you can work with your client that you're working with into making their ideas and stories that they want to make with their business come to life. I didn't realize how much storytelling would play a part in making their ideas kind of just come to life. And I think one of the biggest factors in making that story believable is really getting invested and involved with what your client wants to do and kind of why they want to create what they want to create. Because I believe that every person in small business that wants to create a design identity and logo, they have a reason for that, and I think that reason is very important to consider whenever you're making your logo because they want something that's authentically aligned with what they want to do. And so I think it's really important to understand where they've come from to translate that into a bigger story that their audience might be able to understand. And of course, all the smaller things wouldn't be able to communicate it within a logo, but I think if you're able to translate at least like some of their ideals within that, I think that's kind of what creates a very successful logo that's able to communicate your client's story.
I want to bring back this idea of your love of fantasy. And are there any moments where you feel your fantasy roots sneaking into your design choices a little bit? Like maybe you use a font that feels a little bit more magical than corporate?
Yeah, I definitely think a little bit of that tends to come out in my design work, but I think what it has to deal more with is the symbolism I'm able to use within what I'm creating. I know that's not the biggest reference to fantasy, but I think that by being able to make those very subtle connections to things that have already been created and being able to create something new out of that, that feels like a fresh, new idea kind of is a little bit related to fantasy because that has to deal a lot with just bringing new ideas to life. I think that really translates over to graphic design because it helps to bridge the gap between reality and then fantasy. So I do think a little bit of that comes across whenever I'm trying to do design is just making those small references that create just something new entirely that might not have any big references to reality but kind of just somewhere else.
I think that is so aptly put, and I do think that that's something that we as consumers of graphic design constantly don't even realize how much effort and honestly how magical graphic design can be. But the more I talk to you about it, and I'm in a very basic graphic design class right now, the more I learn about InDesign and font choices and stuff like that, the more I'm starting to notice it everywhere. So I hope that now that our listeners have learned a little bit about graphic design and art and how these visual mediums tell a story, you guys listening, wherever you are, whenever you are, I hope you guys start to see stories in the art around you.
Lydia, thank you so much for joining us today. I know we just scratched the surface of fantasy, art, and design, but you gave us so much to think about and consider.
Yeah, thank you guys so much for having me on this show. I really enjoy what you guys are able to do by kind of just bringing concepts that maybe are a little bit more difficult to understand into something a bit more understandable for a wider audience. And so I just think it's really cool that you guys are able to do that. And I just really thank you guys for letting me join you guys on your podcast.
Well, that's it from the right angle, where we know the real magic isn't just in the story, it's in those who write it And in this case, draw it too.
Until next time, write boldly, read unapologetically,
And stay weird.